Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today with a very special guest, Justin Murphy. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate it.
Justin, there are a lot of ways one can introduce you, but I'm curious, how do you sort of introduce yourself, or how do you sort of describe to people the project or mission that you are trying to achieve?
Well, lately I've been telling people I'm the full stack professor. That's what I'm going for. Basically, I was a professor for about 5 or 6 years, almost 6 years. And yeah, there's a kind of story behind it, but the short version of it is I just basically got fed up with all of the bureaucracy and the kind of increasingly oppressive atmosphere of academia. And at the same time, my internet projects were kind of growing. My blog was growing. I do some videos on YouTube and stuff like that. And it was clear that I was getting traction on the internet. And, all I've ever really set out to do, as an adult in my life, my vocation is to think the best ideas I could, get as close to the real truth as I could, and to communicate those ideas as widely and as effectively as possible. That's the only reason I ever went into academia. And basically it just became increasingly clear that academia felt more and more like a sinking ship every passing month. And my internet projects felt kind of more alive and more influential every passing month. And I figured, I'm only 33. I still have enough piss and vinegar in me to try and, make something new, try to hack it out on my own. So I basically decided to just up and leave academia and go all in on doing my intellectual work full time on the internet.
Totally. And Jonathan Haidt has talked a little bit about, he says sort of the purpose of the university was originally around, finding truth. I'm sort of simplifying radically, but pursuit of knowledge, and now it's sort of evolved into sort of activism over knowledge. And so I say that to ask you, is your experience in the university that you were pursuing truth and that got in the way of some activism, or how did you sort of have a falling out?
Yeah, I think there's this outside view of academia that it's filled with all of these kind of foaming at the mouth radical left-wing activists. But in my experience, there's some truth to that. But in my experience, the real problem is much more mundane than that. It's just the good old-fashioned problem of extreme bureaucratic sclerosis, combined with a kind of oppressive set of political assumptions and political attitudes that are now increasingly well known in the public. But it's not like I felt particularly oppressed by political ideologies. It was just, it's an increasingly suffocating, oppressive environment where no one really says anything particularly interesting and everyone is walking on eggshells. And the job itself, frankly, just kind of sucks. You have to do so much paperwork and all of this kind of, increasingly onerous side work that actually just has nothing to do with seeking the truth or communicating it in any way that's in any way interesting or satisfying.
Totally. And so when Jonathan Haidt has that critique of the university, is he accurate or is he not accurate? Like what are besides what you just mentioned, so what are the challenges of the university today?
Yeah, I think Haidt is a very good, diagnostician of this problem. There is certainly a kind of presumed political ideology that motivates a lot of the ideas and the behaviors of academics. There's definitely a kind of social justice presumption underneath a lot of it, and especially in particular disciplines like in the humanities or in education or what have you. So that's all real, but it paints a somewhat misleading portrait if you imagine it as this kind of hotbed of radicals and activists. No, it's mostly just kind of career bureaucrats, basically. So the political ideology is really just a kind of moralistic gloss on just basically kind of boring, submissive people who really just want a paycheck and some status from this kind of traditional prestige institution. No. So that's how I would see it.
So when people say, or some people say, fear that critical theory is just sort of like eating, like getting into social sciences, but also like eating even the hard sciences, and even like math isn't necessarily safe. Is that overblown?
It's not that it's overblown. It's that I would not identify that as the causal motor of the problem. That's a kind of relatively cheap, superficial gloss that is applied on top of what is a much more mundane and widespread problem of just generalized bureaucratic sclerosis and complacency. And, so it's like the underlying problem is the same problem you would see if you walk into a typical under-functioning government bureaucracy. It's very similar, but the difference is these are intellectuals. So they're able to apply a kind of sophisticated sounding political or ideological gloss to it. I'm just emphasizing here that that's really not the main problem. That's something that's added on afterwards in a rather superficial way, I think.
And can you give some historical overview of how this problem came to be?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I do have a narrative about this. I'm happy to give you the short version. It does seem to be that in the 60s and 70s, when our kind of modern institutions of academia really take the form or the shape that we recognize today, namely left-leaning kind of intellectuals looking for a relatively cushy job, for instance, and being able to get it. That really, the way that we think about it, really happens around the 60s and 70s. That's when, the women's studies departments emerge, and a lot of the, what we now identify as the contemporary academic landscape is established. And my sense is, from talking with lots of other professors who are much older than me, my sense is that it used to be quite good. If you were an intellectual and you just wanted to read books and you just wanted to write and you wanted to be relatively insulated from, the problems of market competition, academia was for some time a pretty nice spot, a pretty good place to be. If you can get a PhD, if you're smart, and you could break in, and frankly, it wasn't that hard to break in, so it wasn't nearly as competitive. If you had what it took to get a PhD, and you could do basic original research, a lot of people got PhDs in the 60s and 70s. The problem was, of course, that they were anticipating growth dynamics that were probably unsustainable. So for people listening to this who might not quite understand how this works, the grad school system is pretty much all about producing more professors. So the raison d'etre of the professor is, in large part, other than teaching and doing the bureaucracy, is to train new grad students. And those new grad students are implicitly preparing to become professors. So you had this very cushy, very attractive, kind of economically insulated career track that intellectuals could get into in the 60s and 70s. But everything from there was expecting, or, kind of embedded in that institution as it emerged, was the expectation of increasing growth in the number of professorships. So really the big problem that you have now is just a sheer overproduction of grad students who once upon a time would get a job as a professor, but now they're just extremely overeducated and quite intelligent people who have given, sometimes as many as 10 years of their life to becoming an academic. And now they're facing just extremely unsatisfying job prospects. And so what has happened is that now there's this abundance of highly educated academic labor, which now occupies a kind of permanent army of cheap adjunct professors. That's the term for basically short-term contract professors. They may or may not get a new contract each semester, basically, and they're often quite underpaid. So basically, that's the essential kind of economic background, is that there's this overproduction of people who can teach and do the bureaucratic work of running a university. But these people were anticipating a high status, high income, satisfying, cushy job. And that's kind of what they went into it for. And so in this environment, think about what types of political and social implications that's going to have. Well, these people see themselves as really important and special and high status, and they're still very addicted to a certain glamorous image of being a professor. It still feels and sounds to them very prestigious. But in fact, the underlying kind of economic reality is that they're extremely vulnerable and precarious, because the fact is their PhD in English is not really useful for anything other than being a professor. So there's this bizarre kind of combination of high expectations in terms of status and income and the prestige with which one sees oneself, and the actual underlying distribution of economic power. And I think, frankly, that's how you should understand a lot of the kind of crazy culture war stuff that you're seeing associated with the university. Is these people don't have really anywhere else to go. They're terrified of doing anything entrepreneurial and staking out on their own, and yet they're basically just stuck in a system that has a really, really high supply of labor.
How does that lead to the bureaucratic sclerosis you were talking about, or sort of the administrative bloat?
Oh, well, my point is that these professors, a lot of professors are willing to do anything pretty much just to keep their job, just to keep their status. They're addicted to this kind of image of themselves. And because of that, they'll take on any amount of kind of stultifying bureaucratic workload, even if it means that the actual reality of the job is they're almost never doing any intellectual work that they originally got into the game for.
Do you have a sense for whether the administrative bloat on the universities is like way bigger than it used to be maybe 30 years ago? And if yes, why that happened? Because that is a different group of people than these grad students, right?
Yeah, so that is definitely the case. It's been well documented. I don't have numbers on me, but it's been mostly in the upper echelons of university administration, I believe. So there's been this proliferation of administrator posts, and I think that's a classic story of just kind of bureaucratic self-perpetuation. Once once an administrator gets a department, right, then they're intrinsically motivated to grow that department. And I think that's basically what's happened over the past few decades.
Yeah. So before getting into how to solve it outside the system, how do you solve it inside the system? Like if you were magically, put in charge of a university, or like what should happen and what's going to happen?
I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question, because I don't think you're solving this from the inside. I just don't think you are at all, which is why I decided to leave. So that's just my honest take on that. I mean, I know there are people out there trying to do that, and I wish them the very best, and I hope they can do it, but I would not put my money on that personally. I see that as impossible. And so, I don't have too much to suggest on that front.
So let's talk about the future of education outside of the university. Maybe you could start with how do you see it playing out?
Well, I think it's going to be chipped away at in many different ways, of course. And I can probably speak best to the way that I'm trying to do it personally. I mean, my little riff here is that I think probably too many people think about what will replace the university or how to replace the university. And I think that's not the best way to think about it. Personally, what I'm interested in is how to disintermediate the functions of the professor. So the wedge I'm trying to create, the part of it that I'm trying to disrupt, is the actual calculations of aspiring professional intellectuals. So talented, intellectually inclined young people, let's say from 18 years old to, even in their last year of their PhD, maybe up until their 30s. This demographic of people who feel called to do research, to seek the truth as a vocation for their life. I think these people more and more need to be shown that they have a higher long-term expected value by trying to create their own intellectual platforms for themselves on the internet, compared to putting in the work and paying your dues to try to break into academia. I'm now convinced of this as an empirical proposition, that for the average intellectually gifted young person who wants to pursue a long-term intellectual life, I firmly believe already we have crossed the threshold where you have a higher expected value to go all in on trying to build your own personal independent platform on the internet. And so that's the part of it I'm trying to tackle. And I'm trying to basically show that and demonstrate that. I'm trying to provide a demonstration effect, because this is essentially what I'm doing with my own projects. And what it basically boils down to is just, for me, it's thinking about the value that professors provide to universities, and then thinking just how can I repackage that value in a way that works on the internet and that resonates with what people want and need in a direct way on the internet. So I'm doing a bunch of things to that effect.
And so, and it's basically it's research, intellectual work, and then teaching, right? And so is that accurate?
Yeah, except teaching should be disaggregated a bit, because it's not really just about teaching. And one of the things you learn if you try to do teaching on the internet with an open mind, one of the things you learn is that what is traditionally called teaching in this kind of academic tradition, or in this university-centric tradition, is actually a pretty bad proxy for a whole bunch of things like mentorship or like community facilitation. And this is something that when you try to do this stuff on the open market, you really start to see this in a new way. So I would say the functions that I was providing to the university was actually this big bag of functions, which now I am disaggregating or unbundling, if you'd like, in a bunch of different ways. Research is one, teaching is another, But teaching is really a kind of, it's almost like I'm providing a social network to other intellectuals in the niches that I am doing research in.
Totally. So you have the podcast, you have the blog, you're starting courses. You describe the Justin Murphy empire as you see it evolving over time.
Yeah, so it pretty much has two major components. The first is my own personal intellectual work. And that's just, where I do my thinking and my speaking and my research and my production of that. I'm inclined to say writing because that is traditionally the dominant medium. But in the internet game, I really am seeing it much more broadly. So I think about it in terms of I do thinking and research work, and then I formulate that into multiple media at the same time, whether that be text and voice and video. I'm increasingly building production output systems that don't even have to distinguish between those two, because as we have better and better things like transcription services working better and better each year, it's actually an extraordinary privilege for intellectuals today to think less and less about, is this going to be a written idea? Is this going to be a video, or is this going to be audio? So I just think about it in terms of the one half of it is me doing all of the same stuff I was doing as a professor in terms of thinking, reading, and then producing ideas and putting them out into the world, or producing work and putting it out into the world. That's one half of what I'm doing. The other half is the kind of more business related decisions, the business model aspect, which I'm just doing in a highly experimental, incremental way, because I'm not a businessman. I never have been, and I don't really know anything about that. So basically, what I'm doing at the moment is just basically testing through like very quick, rapid, agile experiments what works best to basically chip off my intellectual work into different ways. And so what that looks like at the moment is, books, obviously, what I think will be around for a long time. So I'm writing books and selling them. I am doing courses, online courses. The online course industry is actually, booming quite well. So that I think is going to be around for a while. And that's a natural complement to what professors do for sure. But the other one that I think is a little bit harder to process, especially for academics who might want to make this shift, is what I alluded to before as the community facilitation aspect or the mentorship aspect. In the business world, this gets coded in many different ways. Like sometimes in some sectors, it's called coaching. In some sectors, it's called, mentoring. In the business world, they sometimes refer to individual strategy groups as quote unquote masterminds. So there's all this interesting kind of business speak, but the core functions of those things have academic equivalents. So I am also doing things like mentoring people who are trying to do their own intellectual work on their blog or whatever. I'm essentially doing what I was doing for undergrads or grad students, but in this internet-based way where I have to basically kind of create new categories because coaching just sounds corny, or mastermind groups, that doesn't resonate with academics, right? So I'm basically trying to create these new categories, but it's essentially just replicating the tried and true business models that you see in other sectors.
Totally. And so one question I have is, how do you sort of make it, two things. One, just super easy for professors to make the switch to become full stack professors. And part of it is like, creating the tooling and infrastructure that they could do that. But the other part is just like the status, as you mentioned, they're hyper status conscious. That's why they're there. So how do you make it okay? We're seeing in journalism, of course, and even today, Barry Weiss and, Andrew Sullivan just quit their the New York Times and New York Magazine respectively to go to Substack. How do we see that same innovation in academia?
Well, my big wager is that that's going to happen through a demonstration effect. Because at the end of the day, as you're saying, people are ultimately swayed by status and power, and most people will eventually go where the power is. So my essential wager is that I'm just going to try to find a way to win. And when I win sufficiently well enough, then people are going to be like, oh, you mean I can do all this stuff I want to do as an intellectual without playing by any of the rules and without going through these terrible institutions? So basically, once I start making really good money, frankly, and I think people are going to be like, oh, this is real. This is a real option. I'm going to do what Justin's doing. I'm not going to go into academia.
Yeah. Yeah. We're now going to have the conversation that we would have if the mics were off, which I know is the conversations you like to have. So, this is Village Global Podcast. Village Global is a venture firm that I run. I'm also chairman of this company called On Deck, which is an education company. It works very closely with Village Global. Village Global is a big investor in it. And On Deck basically is, the first product it offers is sort of an MBA for founders, basically before they've started their companies. It helps them find co-founders, hires, customers. Think of it like a YC or Village Global Network Catalyst experience, but before you have a company, or often. And we're about to launch one for angel investors too. But the idea we've sort of thought about is like we could just offer it as a service, this sort of like course, because we do community, we do curriculum, and we're going to start that in the entrepreneurial space for people who teach, on growth and sales and other topics. They just come in, give the lecture, and we handle everything else. But we've also, so part I've basically two goals in addition to make Village Global a very successful fund. One is, create a university that helps spur like economic growth and innovation and technology and do that from a business perspective. But the other is sort of participate to, in creating something that is truly about pursuit of knowledge, or enabling people who are pursuing knowledge but don't have the resources to do it to do it in a bigger way. So I'm very interested in the type of work that you're doing and interested in helping others do it too. And with Substack, it's sort of easy to figure out what the tool is, because you just like something where they can have an email list and subscribe. Whereas Professors, you're disaggregating it in a few different ways. So they would need something to have a subscription, but something to also teach. I'm just curious what you think that product ends up looking like, where it's sort of one tap and now you have Professor as or full stack Professor. Like, what is the experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think different people will try different models, but that's not a very interesting question. That's not a very interesting answer, right? So in my view, what you're probably going to see, the most successful full stack professors are really going to double down on this no code movement, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Are you?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, of course.
Yeah, right. So in other words, I think what you're going to see, and this is essentially what I'm doing, is there's not going to be a one size fits all solution where some startup provides some kind of out of the box tool that just gives the full stack professor every tool they need in a fully integrated, SaaS product. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think you're going to see a lot of differentiation, and the full stack professor is going to have a few different inflections. And I think they're going to essentially have to be their own startup founder. And I think the no code phenomenon is a real game changer in this regard, because for me, for instance, I'm not a programmer. I have some very, very basic programming skills, but I would not be able to build a startup if no code was not a thing. And I essentially have a little startup that is just my personal little experimental shell that I'm building to package and frame these different functions that I was alluding to before. And I'm basically thinking about it as a startup. I'm treating it as a startup. It's a separately branded project. And I would simply not have been able to do that if I had to hire a developer or be a developer myself. But basically, I use a no-code stack where I glue together things like MemberStack and Webflow and a Circle community forum. And it all works really quite well. And I use Zapier to basically tie all of those things together. And so people who join, my little startup community basically have the experience of a fairly traditional and quite well functioning, I think, SaaS app. And yet I was able to do that in the course of a few months, really, to get it up and running and make some decent starting revenue. So that's my vision. I think for the full stack professor, the full stack professor will have to basically build their own startup. And most likely that's going to be through no code tools.
Yeah. But most professors aren't going to be as savvy as you. So the question is, can we make it super easy for them to do that?
Well, I'm not sure I agree. I mean, I think if you can do a PhD, you can glue together some no-code tools and make a little SaaS app with no-code tools, right? I mean, I think what you're not going to see is established professors make this change. I mean, if you're over, 35 or 40 and you've been in academia for several years, you're so invested, right? Your sunk costs, whether you see that as a fallacy or not, your sunk costs feel extremely real. And also, for what it's worth, you just lose your edge. You lose your energy. You really do become complacent, and you become fearful of the real world. I mean, I saw this a lot, and I felt it in myself also, as one of the reasons I decided to jump ship right before I felt like I was losing my last ounce of, the piss and vinegar that would allow me to do this sort of thing. So yeah, I'd say right off, the older professors, they're not going to be building no-code startups to defect from academia. No, of course not. But your average PhD student, I think when they see the results I'm having, they're going to learn no-code tools pretty quickly and quite happily, I think.
Yeah, totally. When you mentioned that some professors are going to do it differently, What's another way you could imagine a professor doing it?
Well, as we're seeing right now in the creator economy, or what they call the passion economy, there are many different models, right? There are many different ways to make it. You can do a paid newsletter full time, and that's your main hustle. I think for a certain type of intellectual, for a certain type of researcher, perhaps most naturally we might think of, let's say, finance professors, right? Let's take your average, early career finance professor who maybe finds academia just to be terribly stultifying, and perhaps, they're not making as much money as they might like, and it's just an unhappy situation for them. It's increasingly viable to do a really high quality kind of daily newsletter play, right? There are lots of people now who are making very, very good money doing an everyday finance newsletter. That's just one example, right? So that would be a kind of version of the full stack professor model that I'm describing, or what I also call the indie thinker model. And that's for a certain type of person, that's going to be more than enough. That's going to be perfectly good. You could just do that, right? But I think for other people with different strengths and different weaknesses, you're going to want to piece together a different ecosystem of tools and platforms. The online course game seems to be thriving, and that's an obvious context in which professors will have a comparative advantage, especially when professors realize how relatively low the quality bar is for online courses. I mean, this is like a big open secret. I'm so stunned that professors don't really realize how easily they could dominate the online course game if they decided to move into it. And so some people could just do courses, right? For me, yeah. So that's basically what I think you're going to see is differentiation by research domains, but also kind of personality traits. People will build their own kind of boutique full stack professor offerings based on what they're good at and what they're not good at.
Who are groups who can't do this? Like if you're in the hard sciences or you require labs or something, like is that much harder? Like who is this for? Who is it not for?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's certainly limitations. I think the hard sciences are a good example of where this would be difficult, where you need basically a large sum of money to do your basic work. If you need a big laboratory, that's possibly going to be a problem. But even there's interesting innovation taking place. I don't know if you've ever heard of Michael Tumim. You might want to look him up. He's doing interesting innovation in this front. He's a computer scientist, and he's basically trying to hack together financially viable ways for what I'm calling, full stack professors or indie thinkers to do relatively hard scientific work that traditionally requires a lot of funding. There are ways to hack it. The point that he makes is that the R&D budgets for big tech corporations are massive. Like I think he told me that the budget, Microsoft's budget for R&D is way bigger than the entire National Science Foundation for the United States government, right? So if you can be creative, I think there are even possibilities for the hard sciences to carve out interesting independent niches for themselves. The people that are not going to be able to do this also outside of the hard sciences, frankly, and not to sound rude or anything, but frankly, there are a lot of people who literally went into academia because they did not want to work hard and because they wanted to pretty much have an insulated, cushy job where they just have high status kind of guaranteed to them. I'm seriously, I'm not like subtweeting anyone here or being rude, but just frankly, there are a lot of people like that in academia. So those people are screwed because they're on a sinking ship and they don't have. I don't see how they're going to get off of it.
Yeah, 5 years from now, are you envisioning there's like 1,000 full stack professor, or what happens if the professors just start sort of going, D2C? Does it mean like universities are fucked, or what happens?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways it's already happening, but it's hard to see because of how things are framed or perceived, right? So I would say, for instance, the 27-year-old right now who is making a good living by producing philosophy videos on YouTube, for instance, is essentially a kind of fork of academia. That is someone who traditionally probably would have pursued a PhD in philosophy, but realized a few years ago which way the winds are blowing and made a good choice and is now doing much better than he would have done or she would have done had she gone the academic route. So in some ways, I think this is already happening. It just doesn't get registered as the phenomenon that I'm talking about. I think in the short term, I think if my success that I'm having 1 year out of, I quit academia 1 year ago. If my success continues to grow simply at the growth rates I'm currently having, I think within a year, maybe 2 years, you're going to see a lot of people who are currently either early career academics or currently in PhD programs looking at my results and literally quitting what they're doing to do what I'm doing. Because and I'm not tooting my own horn or anything like that. I'm just saying there have not been that many people who have visibly and publicly chosen to straight up quit academia to do the internet full time and who have had success in a visible way. And so I'm already having, I'm a little bit of success. I'm certainly not like super rich or powerful or anything by any means. But I'm doing what I said I was going to do, and it's basically working as I predicted, as I called it would. And so I think what will happen then is, assuming, and of course things could go terribly wrong. I'm not like arrogant or anything. Perhaps I'll fail for sure. It's totally possible. But if I succeed in what I'm trying to do, and it looks like I am, then in the short term, you're going to have people defecting. And then what I think is going to happen is the people who choose to go into academia are going to be more and more, there's going to be more and more selection bias for essentially the laziest, most complacent, and kind of like politically motivated academics. So what's going to happen actually is that as I'm more and more successful, or people like me, I should say, are more and more successful, the political problems that you're seeing within academia are actually going to get worse and worse, because those are going to be the only types of people who even want to go into academia anymore. Then it'll just be a question of, kind of long, like how long does our society want to subsidize that, right? That'll probably reach some kind of breaking point. But that's essentially a kind of political question that I think is underdetermined, and I don't know what the final end game for that is.
Yep, totally. Yeah, my sense is all these, the top schools will always be fine. We just heard an announcement, a week ago or so that Harvard is going full Zoom, and there were, side by side comparisons of like, streaming for Netflix, streaming for, for other streaming services, and then streaming for Harvard. And it just shows how, sort of how ridiculously, overpriced the offering is. But I wonder if it's just such a sacred, institution, that the best people will just keep continuing to go. And maybe, the best universities will be fine, but it's the sort of, ones that are mid-tier that will suffer. But it's interesting to think, like, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how much higher education will actually be impacted.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's difficult to speculate. I do suspect that the Ivy League brands are very powerful and will remain very powerful. And if you can get a PhD at Harvard and play that game well, then there are still many good reasons to do that for sure. So I definitely wouldn't expect that to disappear or go bankrupt or anything like that anytime soon. However, perceptions of that will change, and I think the general social value that is assigned to that, in other words, the actual effectiveness of that prestige marker, I think is already decreasing, frankly, for what it's worth. Yeah. I mean, so, I think getting a PhD from Harvard will still be attractive to many people, and there will be smart, interesting, successful people who continue to choose to do that, for sure. But the unique causal power of that, right? The actual improvement in your power over the world that gives you, I think is going to be decreasing. Frankly, that's my hunch.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that makes sense. I want to transition a little bit to your intellectual work. Why don't you, if you were to describe sort of the thread that you've kept pulling over the last few years in your specific intellectual work, how would you describe sort of the question that you keep asking in different ways, or the thread that you keep pulling in terms of what drives you down certain rabbit holes?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it's difficult to answer because, frankly, to do a PhD in a competitive way where you're trying to get an academic job, you really have to do what it's expedient for you to do. You have to choose a subfield of research that you're capable of doing extremely complicated methods in a way that fits a kind of substantive niche that is hot at the moment, that hiring committees are going to like you for. So pretty much my intellectual coming of age through my grad school experience was highly conditioned by just strategic imperatives. And most of academia is that. And so what's interesting is that my research as a professor and including my PhD and all of my kind of post-PhD academic peer-reviewed publications, I don't really identify with them too much. I mean, I did good work and I'm proud of it, and some of it was interesting for sure. But it was all basically expediency. And frankly, what's interesting is you don't really learn this about yourself in that kind of brutally honest way until you take the plunge and leave academia, and all of a sudden you're able to do whatever you want on the open market. It's hugely illuminating about what you're really interested in. I think had I stayed in academia, if I was still a professor, I would of course be talking to you as if my academic research was my absolute passion and my genuine interest. And I could ape that as well as anyone, I could mimic that. And I did. So that's a bit of a caveat to answer your question, that what I'm going to say actually doesn't really map onto if you looked at like my Google Scholar. But what I would say is that for me, the long run interest or kind of research agenda that I've always been personally really interested in is, frankly, it's been the question of how institutions pacify people creatively and intellectually and politically. That's something that has always been an abiding interest of mine, and I tried to do that in a kind of instrumental, political science research way. I was trained as a quantitative political scientist, and that was something I tried to tackle here and there in some of my research. But what's interesting now is that now that I'm totally free, I'm able to pretty much do it in my own way. And what that looks like now is having to find ways that resonate on the internet, and that's kind of an interesting challenge in its own right. But this is how it comes full circle, because I've always been interested in how exactly is it that institutions essentially lure individuals into kind of investing in those institutions, but then kind of sucking the life out of them. That's something I've always been interested in, trying to model that and then figure out by implication kind of pathways for escaping that, for kind of maximizing one's vitality and creative or intellectual or political freedom. Yeah, so that went from a kind of academic interest of mine to now a kind of experimental, like personal life project in a way.
Yeah, totally. There are two authors that you are really excited, or think that you're really excited about. One that you wrote a whole book on. I pronounce his name incorrect. Based Deleuze, is that how do you pronounce his name?
Yeah, that's good enough. You would say Deleuze, but yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so talk about what you find so interesting about him and why it's important that people understand him, and maybe give some color there. Yeah,
sure. Well, again, the interesting background I think for people who listen to your podcast here is probably to talk a little bit about the kind of business model considerations, because once I decided to leave academia, I had to think, okay, of all the things that I'm personally really interested in working on, and now I can do it however I want in the open, no rules, no holds barred. I did nonetheless have to, think a little bit about what type of projects and what types of framings are going to play well on the internet. And so I chose to focus on some of the most obscure, abstract French philosophers, because basically my market thesis here is that the people that are experts on the super abstract French philosophers, such as Gilles Deleuze, are so far off the deep end of politicized academic gobbledygook, just genuinely sheer nonsense in the most kind of extreme and transparent way, that I figured, okay, well, the supply of actually interesting, valuable insight about what these crazy thinkers were actually saying, the supply of that is incredibly low, because all of the smart people doing work on that, it's completely monopolized by the kind of most excessively idiotic and kind of politicized academic language and linguistic kind of signaling games. So I made this hypothesis that I've always actually been quite interested in a lot of those abstract, flowery French philosophers, and I read a lot of their books, and I actually do think that there's a kind of core message often that a lot of people simply don't know, because it is written in a really obscure way. And so I figured this was a great place to start, because the supply of good stuff on these people is so low, and I'm capable and competent of doing it. And virtually no one is doing this in a public way that is actually trying to communicate with real people. And so that was why I decided to do Deleuze, because that's pretty much the background there.
Yeah, totally. And the other thinker that you write about, is it Bataille? You're doing a course on how do I pronounce his name?
Yeah, that's right. George Bataille.
And did you say you want him to be, or you hope that he's for the left what Girard is for the right, or was that Deleuze?
Yeah, that's right. That was something I tweeted not too long ago. Yeah, you want me to unpack that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, they were somewhat related in that Girard does cite Bataille. Bataille is of an earlier generation, but Girard does cite Bataille, and they have some shared roots, if you will, aside from being French. In particular, the French anthropological tradition associated with people such as Durkheim and Marcel Mauss. And so they both rely quite heavily on anthropology as case material or data or evidence for developing their various social theories. And Bataille was quite an extraordinary case. So in many ways, he's very idiosyncratic, but they were both very interested in religion, and they were both very interested in questions of the sacred and how sacredness is produced, right? So Girard is very well known for the concept of the scapegoat, which a lot of people know right now, and a lot of people are talking about right now for good reason. I think it is very relevant. But whereas Girard is seen as quite useful and attractive for people on the center right, let's say, Bataille was a revolutionary left-winger. He always had a fraught relationship to the Communist Party. He was never really a kind of willing, person who was willing to basically just, say whatever the party wanted them to say. But he was definitely sociologically and ideologically a fellow traveler of the Communist Party, even if he always kind of retained his own personal intellectual sovereignty. So sociologically and intellectually and politically, he was a man of the left, no doubt about it. And even if he never quite fit into it. And so, he was very interested in, for instance, how one produces the sacred through ritualistic sacrifice, for instance. And so I have a theory that I think one of the major problems with the contemporary left is that you really can't have a robust and meaningful kind of egalitarian political tendency without some form of religious commitment. I personally, that's a belief that I have, which would take some more time to unpack. But if you think that is true, well, one of the interesting things that explains is why the contemporary left is so theological in many ways. A lot of people have noted this, that in many ways the left seems possessed of a kind of religious zealotry, and in many ways, that you can point to that. You can demonstrate that in a few different ways. You see it in the discourse, but you also see it in kind of the structure of the activism, the way that the activism and the actual results of the activism are just like radically disaligned, and it's really ultimately a kind of religious fervor that makes sense out of it at the end of the day. And so, if you think that the contemporary, let's call it the woke left, as people are wont to call it nowadays, if you think that's a losing path, or it's not going to work, or it's bad for any reason, but you are nonetheless, you have kind of left-wing personality traits, and you're still, at the end of the day, you lean left in your political preferences, then you're going to need someone like Bataille to basically provide a theory of what the contemporary secular atheist left has tried to kind of act like they're too good for, but which they find themselves replicating unconsciously. So I argue, just like Girard provides a kind of Christian anthropological vocabulary for navigating a kind of coherent and attractive center-right position today, I think Bataille provides a similarly sophisticated left-leaning vocabulary for people who are trying to find a kind of genuine, meaningful, radical, but also egalitarian left-leaning politics.
Yeah. And so let me tell you my understanding of Girard. You tell me where it's simplistic or should be edited. So my understanding is he says something like, desire is based on what other people want. We want what other people want. And the fact that we want what other people want creates drives us to sort of converge towards similar desires, and that leads to conflict because we're fighting over the same things effectively. Mm-hmm. And in order to solve that conflict, we need to have this sort of ritualistic sacrifice or scapegoat someone such that we can sort of unleash this energy and things can start over again. And I think what Christianity is saying, instead of like scapegoating, or religion saying scapegoating externally, like scapegoat internally, like scapegoat yourself or something, like, and look internally. Where is that simplistic or wrong?
Oh, I think that's a perfectly fine rehearsal of the basic ideas. I mean, that is the well-known kind of contemporary version of Girard that circulates, and I think I'm not an elitist. I think that does a good enough job of getting at some of the core ideas in a way that people understand. Yeah, and then I don't know. I think you maybe didn't mention the scapegoat being, I think, one of the key concepts that people associate with Girard. So the idea is essentially that because desire is mimetic, it has this kind of intrinsically zero-sum kind of bedrock to it. And because that's ultimately irresolvable, it essentially requires a kind of scapegoat mechanism as almost like I tend to think of it as a kind of like a pressure valve. It allows this kind of irresolvable pressure cooker of mimetic desire to blow off some steam, essentially, with some kind of sacrificial victim, the scapegoat. And, what's interesting about Bataille is that he really is pointing to a very similar problematic, if you'd like to use a French term, actually, that Girard is pointing to, but he provides a very different suggestion about what the main problem is. And for Bataille, I think it's really quite fascinating. What Bataille says is that all systems will eventually run into moments where growth is no longer possible for whatever reason. And maybe not forever, but there will be moments at least where growth is not happening. And when growth is foreclosed for any reason, then energy has to be wasted within the system. And so it's very interesting because it's a similar kind of pressure cooker kind of mental model, and there will be these kind of untenable moments where steam has to be blown off. But what Bataille says is that, or what Bataille seems to think, what he seems to suggest is that it is possible for us to develop social mechanisms that blow off that steam in relatively beneficial and pro-social ways. And so I'm speaking somewhat out of school here, and scholars of Girard and Bataille would probably reprimand me here for being speaking a little too fast and loose. But basically, what I think you can argue is that the scapegoat phenomenon that Girard points to, and which a lot of people see in contemporary political problems, especially the kind of witch hunts and mobbing behavior that you see today, what Bataille is suggesting is that if we want to avert that kind of scapegoat mobbing tendency, there is a solution, and it is purposeful wastage. It's what he calls expenditure without reserve. He says that every system, whether it be a physical system, but also social systems, will need moments where if growth is no longer happening or it's no longer possible, then the energy that cannot be invested in growth has to be burned with literally no use whatever. And that's his theory for what ritualistic sacrifice is. So if you look throughout the ages, societies in all times and places have curiously given a lot of time and space to what seems to be completely useless wastage of resources. The most famous example here being the tradition of potlatch, where traditional primitive tribes would literally just burn goods or burn slaves, for instance. And there's a whole kind of anthropological story about that. I don't want to kind of bore you with a lecture or anything, but basically the implication for us that I think is extraordinary and is the kind of left-wing alternative to Girard that I was tweeting about is essentially that we need to create, and we can, in fact, create institutions where there is a kind of sacred expenditure, a kind of non-utilitarian, completely useless expenditure, and that this produces a series of kind of sociological mechanisms that are cohesive, that are communitarian, and that essentially generates kind of religious belonging and religious kind of community and peace dynamics. So that's the thesis, anyway.
Yeah. And what's sort of say more about the sort of Christian response or the Christ response or the religious response to it?
Well, Bataille was not a Christian, and he was a wild man. I mean, he was basically trying to build a kind of secular religion. He was an atheist, and but what he thought was that you could basically replicate the mechanisms undergirding religion, and that you could use them in a kind of atheistic way to produce desirable social phenomena. And so, that I think that's an interesting debate. I'm not convinced that that's actually possible, but there's an obvious kind of consistency with those people today who see in traditional values or traditional religion or Christianity or whatever, there isn't a visible kind of hearkening back to traditional value systems right now. I think in people trying to kind of process what is widely seen as the failure of liberalism and the impossibility of a sustainable liberalism as people become increasingly interested in traditional value systems. I think Bataille essentially, if you're interested in Christianity and you're also interested in a genuine radical left politics that is not, resentful and is not violent, and is genuinely about freedom and egalitarian redistribution to the maximum possible, then a kind of interesting combination of Bataille and Christianity, I think, is increasingly attractive will be, that's kind of predictive. It will be increasingly an exciting and promising pathway for left-wingers who are trying to avoid the kind of woke version of the left today.
Is the idea that you sort of scapegoat internally, or is there a better way of saying that?
Yeah, I'm not. I would say, the scapegoat is one conceptual device that is interesting and useful as far as it goes. But I do think that what Bataille calls expenditure without reserve it's just something different. It's essentially a kind of anti-utilitarian gesture, where you can think of it as a kind of as an internal scapegoating, or a kind of scapegoating of the social system by the social system or something like that. Like when we have social rituals to engage in pure wasteful expenditure of resources, such as just simply burning valuable resources for no reason other than a kind of joint communitarian spectacle and gesture. You could think of that as society kind of conducting a sort of internal scapegoating of itself in some ways, of its own kind of utilitarian possession, if you will. And this is where I think the Christian kind of vocabulary comes in handy here, because ultimately the underlying hypothesis here is that modern Western societies have in fact become so materialistic and so utilitarian. I mean, it so suffuses our most basic assumptions about what the world is to I think an extraordinarily wide degree in sophisticated, educated, intelligent, Western circles. It's really, truly almost impossible for people like you and I to access a genuine kind of religious attitude, precisely because we just see utilitarianism is kind of so baked into what we see as good and normal, that is ultimately, the thesis here is that is ultimately what's at the bottom of all of the corruption that we're seeing in our institutions today, in a way. And that through kind of large scale expenditure without reserve or ritualistic sacrifice of one kind or another, that is a kind of replicable, reproducible social practice with real sociological effects that produces antidotes in its very practice. It produces psychological and sociological antidotes to the corruption that is associated with a truly over materialistic, obsessively utilitarian society.
Is the root of the corruption or the problems you're saying is a utilitarianism that fails on its own merits, or just like, or how does it create problems?
Yeah, well, I think this is one lens to see what through which we can see what's going on today. I mean, modern Western, American society, let's say, we don't really recognize anything between each other that is anything other than essentially a utilitarian type of framework. And I'm not necessarily talking about money, but I'm just saying, at the end of the day, if we cannot communicate to each other in claims about why this is good from a utilitarian perspective, it's almost like nothing else can register. It's the only register that makes any sense for human beings in modern Western civilizations to communicate with each other across groups, across, let's say subcultures. It really is the only common underlying register, I would argue. And so is it really such a surprise that we have these insane culture wars where people in various professions are peddling transparent lies that are malicious and essentially about kind of growing their own economic power at the cost of a completely shameless kind of performance and exploitation of morality? Is it really any surprise that we have these insanely divisive subcultural differences and political polarization where pretty much everyone will say anything they can to preach to their own choir to get a little bit more security or income or feeling of personal community satisfaction for their own little group? Is it really such a mystery that our culture is so frayed and so divisive and so transparently based on kind of selfish and small group motivated petty interests? I would say that's not a coincidence. It's because we literally do not see any value in each other outside of a core kind of utilitarian calculus. And I think that's in large part because, God is dead. We have killed God. We really do see ourselves as genuinely post-God. And what that means is we essentially see ourselves as God. And when you see your own interests and the calculation of your own interests as essentially God, well, guess what? The real serious social problems start to open up. That's my take anyway.
Yeah, this segues a little bit to what you hinted earlier, at which you mentioned the contemporary left, although you probably say the contemporary right too, is sort of lacking a religious component, and that creates a lot of problems. So let's fully unpack that. You started already a little bit, and then talk about how you think we could have a solution in sort of a postmodern world.
Oh man, well, I don't know if I'm in the business of offering large scale solutions like that, but that's in part because that is based on what maybe some of you might find as a valuable diagnosis, which is that, I mean, I think one of the most difficult empirical truths we're facing right now is that the possibility of this kind of large scale intellectual narrative that is going to solve the big kind of macro problems of society, I think this is just radically off the table. I mean, I think any intellectual who's kind of posturing as this diagnostician of society as a whole has missed the boat. They've missed a really important kind of empirical phenomenon that has already happened, which is the fragmentation and the polarization that we're witnessing. I mean, the simple fact is that words mean different things to different subgroups now in a really root way. So I think we have different groups in our society. Let's just talk about American society to keep things simple. There are many subgroups that are running on fundamentally different operating systems for what reality even means. And I think you really have to take this seriously. And I do take it seriously. I take it seriously enough that I do kind of refuse to provide some kind of bird's eye view where here's this clever idea where we're going to kind of solve the aggregate social problems. I think if you're asking that question, you're already making a major mistake. You're at the wrong level of analysis. And the question then becomes, embedded where you are, in the subculture where you are, what types of ideas or projects can you institute and pursue and develop in a way that's materially available to you and kind of sociologically, linguistically available to you and the people that you're actually connected to in your social networks? What types of projects can you pursue to basically create more freedom in the world, create more power and potentiality? This is a very Spinozan idea that basically, increasing the potential to act is pretty much one of the only kind of main unilateral goals. So if you just focus on basically increasing the potential of the people you're actually connected to, increasing the ability of people around you to act, that in and of itself is one of the best things, and perhaps one of the only things you could do if what your long-term goal is to figure out ways that these different social subgroups can potentially one day talk again to each other. I mean, I think it's not even clear. It's actually quite hard to imagine how that's ever going to happen. But to me, the ultimate kind of operating system that will potentially connect the different fragmented subgroups is just optimizing for just sheer potentiality, sheer freedom, sheer potency would be another word for it. If you simply optimize for that, then I think you have some chance of different subcultures that are optimizing for that kind of freedom. Those subcultures can merge or at least communicate, I think. But short of that, I think any type of large scale aggregate solution is essentially a kind of snake oil that makes someone sound really smart, and it does abide by a kind of traditional model of what the public intellectual was. But I think anyone who tries to present that kind of solution just doesn't understand how bad the problem already is.
Yeah, and it seems that sense making is only getting harder and harder as we continue to fragment and sort of atomize even deeper. And I'm just curious if there are even collective identities that we can cohere around, right? Like religion used to be a big one and still is, in certain parts of the world, obviously. But then, nationalism also, like, and of course these are, there are great things to them and there are problematic things to them if applied incorrectly. But like, do you see sort of like cohering identities or forms of identity that can work, whether it's those two or others in sort of, a postmodern world, or do we need even newer ones? Or how do you think about sort of the sort of atomization or fragmentation versus sort of the cohering?
Yeah, it's a really thorny question. I mean, I do have some intuitions or hunches about this, and I was just alluding to one. I'll try to make a little bit more sense out of it, which is that what the situation looks like to me is that within institutions, you have increasingly constraining oppressive dynamics. So wherever you look, whether it be large corporations or government bodies or nonprofits or whatever the case might be, universities for sure, you're seeing a kind of acceleration of politics, of constraint, of narrowing down potencies, of containing and constraining potentiality. And that is a one vector. Okay, so set that off to the side. What you're also seeing is people who are seeing that and they're like, no, thank you. I'm jumping ship at the first opportunity. And then you have all these people who are seeking exit from the increasingly suffocating dynamics of the mainstream institutions. And so what I think I see happening is that the people who exit institutions, because they're going all in on this kind of just radically open-minded, affirmative drive of basically just saying, I don't know where this is going, but I know that I'm interested in maximizing my own freedom and I'm interested in maximizing everyone else's freedom outside of these institutional dynamics. Like, if that's all you're really committed to in the short term, those people are able to talk to each other way more effectively, way more rapidly, and way more, I think, constructively. And so I don't know what the next step, I don't know what the next stage or the next step is from there, but it is not, I think, too hard to see that if there is this kind of exit dynamic where multiple people in multiple subcultures for multiple reasons are making their own little exits, and really they're just interested in reconstituting kind of their own freedom on what is essentially an open market, then, you know, I don't want to sound corny here, but this is where I start to get kind of bullish on America, because to me, this is essentially America. This is what the ideal of America and what made America so amazing historically. In a way, my kind of longer term expectation here, in some way, I'm quite bullish on America right now, which is I think an unpopular opinion, because I think all the institutional problems that we're seeing, which a lot of people are rightly lamenting and very sad about, it's really just going to force people to reconvene on the outside. And yeah, I'd be selling you snake oil if I tried to give you some kind of really confident prediction about how that pans out. But from my own experience and observations, I do have this hunch that from that basis, new and better things become possible. And if the institutional dynamics are actually incentivizing us and forcing us to do that, perhaps more aggressively and more rapidly than other countries, precisely because our institutions are so bad, maybe that's actually going to be a good thing.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a contrarian opinion. I mean, we just passed July 4th a couple weeks ago, and, you know, it was the least patriotic or, July 4th I've ever been a part of or seen. And so, like, how does America rebrand in your view? How do we rebrand it in a way that, you know, you can be patriotic and not be corny or something or wrong?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I think this might be one of those biases of people who are successful within institutions, this idea that you need to package it and sell it to other people in a way that makes sense. I mean, obviously, if you're going to be succeeding on the open market, you know, providing goods or services or whatever, there's obviously a branding aspect, and branding is real and important. But when it comes to the actual long-term dynamics of a country or of a nation, it's not really an important consideration to think of to think of a framing for the project. Like, you don't actually have to sell it to anyone. You have to figure out what the dynamics are, and then you need to ride those waves intelligently and creatively. But what I'm talking about is actually, you don't need to rebrand America. You don't actually need to sell what I'm talking about. Like, people have to, like, what I'm essentially arguing is that these are imminent dynamics that are happening. And if people who don't like what's happening within the institutions simply decide to go their own way, which frankly to me still seems as possible as ever, and more possible with all of the new affordances we have. I think it's never been easier to start a business of some kind, and all you need is that kind of local heuristic. All you need is for people to increasingly learn that that's more and more available, and the institutions are less and less attractive. That if that is true, if my hypothesis is correct, all you need is for people to realize that and to actually pursue what is imminently attractive to them in that moment. You don't need to describe and write a book about this pattern and effectively get that book into the hands of millions of people in a way that resonates with them. You don't need to do that. No, you'd actually just everyone needs to follow the basic local heuristic, and the word will get out to other people around in your network that, it's time to jump ship and do your own thing.
Yeah. To a tweet I had the other day about unbundling the university, you mentioned that there will be sort of N masterclasses and N clubhouses, one for each psychologically significant subcultural difference. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I just think that you're going to see a lot of differentiation by personality traits. I think personality traits are real. People have very different skills and strengths and weaknesses, and also what people enjoy doing is very different. And we have a lot of pretty good knowledge about what those distributions look like. I think the Big Five model is it has some critics for sure. No social scientific model is perfect, but I think it's incredibly useful for thinking about these issues because when you look at that research and a lot of people will be able to relate to this in their own life if they simply compare themselves to other people. The fact is that people enjoy different things and are good at different things. And what you see in the economy right now is that if you look at how the creator economy or the passion economy is playing out, it seems to be that the people who do best are the people who go all in on their most unique idiosyncratic traits. And so because of that, there's a ton of room for differentiation, especially when you already see in the creator economy that personality, it's kind of an automatic differentiator. If you're doing content, if you're doing the kind of full stack professor model or the indie thinker model, simply doing your research and trying to communicate it in public, you don't have to try with any kind of strategic intent to, I'm going to maximize this personality trait because I'm good at this. You don't even need to do anything like that. No, you just do what you can do, the best you can do it in the way that you think is cool. And you're going to find that the audience that comes to you is already automatically highly differentiated. And that's simply for the obvious reason that it's going to be the people that are like you for whom it really resonates. So there's already this, I think, extremely rigorous kind of personality-based differentiation mechanism that is taking place in the creator economy and the passion economy. So what you're seeing now with a lot of the big startups that are kind of building things in this space, like Masterclass or, the other examples that you cited is, you can in the short term have big startups with a lot of venture capital build a big thing and build a pretty big tent, right? Like Masterclass is going to be able to get a lot of people super interested in their kind of edutainment videos, no doubt about it. But that big tent is only going to last so long, right? Because it's not that hard for me to look at Masterclass and decode, okay, so there's millions of people who might like this content, but I could make it a little bit weird in the way that I like. And maybe I'm only going to have a total addressable audience of, maybe 50,000 people. I'm pulling numbers out of thin air, but 50,000 people is more than enough for one person to have an amazingly happy and successful business on. So I just see that as the ultimate long run equilibrium of all of these startups that are based on kind of the content creator economy. It's, all the big tents, they can last for a little while, but they're going to get chipped away into a large number of small tents simply automatically by everyone creating content in the way that is most interesting to them.
Yeah. You've identified yourself in one podcast as a libertarian communist.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just a little provocation, I guess, because I am very interested and always have been and still feel strongly committed to the necessity for egalitarian redistribution. I do believe in a very deep way that no person is free until everyone is free. And so long as there's anyone in my country who is born into a life where they don't have the basic resources they need to live a dignified life, so long as there's even one person who's born into that situation, I will never be free. I will never be fully content. I will never have a truly full and good life. Things will never be just until everyone is looked after in a radical way. I do believe that. However, I understand economics and I'm a realist and I don't make things up just to please what I see as moral imperatives. I think that's frankly the problem that most leftists make is they start with a radical moral imperative, which I think is good and true, and then they will simply backfit some kind of ludicrous economic theory to reflect and support the moral imperative. And so, if I call myself a libertarian communist, it's just because I think you can affirm a kind of radical necessity for human beings to look after each other and be obligated to each other. And then also say, oh yeah, economics is real, so libertarianism is pretty much true when it comes to empirical models of how the world works. The question is, what do you do then? Well, I don't know, but the job of an intellectual is not to know everything. That's where you start to make things up, and you start to be selling snake oil, and you start getting trapped in a ton of lies. So, I have some little theories, like everyone probably does, about how you can, square the circle or what have you. But the most important thing in my mind is to kind of separate moral and ethical requirements and commitments from empirical models, and make the synthesis of those two a kind of honest, scientific, objective process that is figured out collectively through trial and error.
Totally. So, I mean, is it a sort of a fancy way of just saying capitalist?
Well, no, because I think, because I do think that there is a real problem and shortcoming for people who are a little too comfortable with capitalism, where it is very common, I think, for libertarians and self-identified capitalists to be relatively kind of morally comfortable with the preponderance of suffering that exists at the lower rungs of our society. I do think that's real. I do think that's a problem. So in other words, I criticized the leftist mental model a minute ago. I think my critique of the right-leaning mental model would be that, because under a kind of libertarian framework, everyone is free to do the best that they can, and everyone will, in the long run, be rewarded in a way that is proportionate to their marginal product or what have you. That it does provide a kind of moral rationalization. It does become a kind of medicine, if you will, that lets people sleep at night, I think, despite the existence of often extreme poverty and a lot of extreme social suffering, even if it's kind of twisted and displayed in perverted ways. And so, yeah, I don't think it's as simple as saying, isn't that just capitalist? Because it is an urgent problem. It is an urgent and immediate problem that there are people who are born into the world without the resources to live a dignified life, and there are always going to be some of those people under a straight capitalist model. You could debate that, perhaps, and we can have that debate. But I find that capitalists are indeed a little too comfortable with that. Yeah,
totally. But just in terms of practically how you amend for that, if you don't want the government to do it.
Yeah, well, there are internal mechanisms, right? I mean, I think we could be. I think libertarians and capitalists could be more interested in communism in the sense of small c. Communitarianism would be like a less triggering word, right? And of course, many rich people and libertarians and capitalists, of course, they in practice, they have families and they take care of their friends and they do often share their wealth widely with everyone they can, and there's philanthropy, of course. But I think, frankly, this is where Bataille comes in, because this is exactly what we were talking about before. Even our philanthropy is very rationalized. All of our kind of rational libertarian kind of redistribution instincts, it's so rationalized that I would argue it nonetheless fails to provide for the people it's trying to provide the real ultimate kind of social and I dare say kind of spiritual need, right? I do essentially think that, and I think to really redistribute the core values of human existence, to really ensure that everyone has a dignified life, actually requires more kind of extravagant and less rationalized, less calculated forms of generosity and expenditure, even to the point of literally senseless, useless waste. That's the lesson of Bataille. And if your listeners still find that just utterly bizarre, like, why would we waste resources? Who is getting helped by wasting resources? If that still just seems utterly bizarre, I would just point to that as being a little bit of evidence for the fact that we are in fact so truly captured by this kind of utilitarian model, which is in fact the ultimate problem that keeps us all kind of running on extremely oppressive and divisive train tracks.
Yeah. The thing I sort of want to close with, I've heard this theory that, a lot of people are talking about sort of the disintegration of classical liberalism, and that some people say that, or go further to say, like, the only sort of ideologies that have constituencies sort of at scale today are sort of this cultural Marxism, whatever you want to call it, the far left, or the far right, sort of populist nationalism, whatever you want to call that, or sort of Catholicism, Christianity / Islam, or Islam. How do you sort of think about, I guess, different people have different words for it, but just sort of the classical liberalism, like basically the idea that there is no center, the center is untenable, the center cannot hold?
Well, I would definitely affirm that proposition in the sense that I was talking earlier about. I do see fragmentation and polarization as this kind of runaway train, which is like a genie that we're not going to get back into the bottle, or at least I don't think anyone can see how you're going to get that genie back in the bottle. So in that sense, I do think that most kind of centrist, how should I say, centrist performances, or people offering themselves up as centrist mediators, are usually playing a kind of con that they're not even fully conscious of themselves. If that's what you mean by the center will not hold, I agree. I think the center is really no longer available in that sense. And frankly, there are still a lot of people who are trying to occupy it. This is the kind of people who still write books with like big publishers, or people who write New York Times op-eds, like people who are still playing that institutional game, generally almost to a T. They all play this game of the liberal centrist mediator, even if they're leaning left or if they're leaning right, whatever, they still kind of pretend to occupy this bird's eye view. And that is just part of their core posture, even though I think it's basically just over. And in that sense, I think the center will not hold. On the other hand, I think where you find yourself when you exit institutions, and when you radically exit institutions, I have found that a lot of the political games that seemed super important and real and live when you were playing some kind of institutional game, all of a sudden they melt away. And it's like, I think increasingly there's just less and less need to have political opinions at all, frankly. I mean, I do think that we are entering a kind of accelerating capitalist, technologically determined kind of wave, if you will, a wave of civilizational advance. I think in other words, to use a social science term, I see it as it's all endogenous. Like what will happen is largely outside of our control. There are various nonlinear, highly complex kind of systemic dynamics going on. Those dynamics don't really care about whether I like the Democrats or I like the Republicans. And I think there will be an increasingly, popular awareness among truly educated and truly intelligent people. I think you're going to see people actually care less and less about what their political opinions are, and instead they're going to focus on just building things. And again, this is why I remain weirdly bullish on America, because I think this is what America always did really well, and it's kind of in our DNA that at the end of the day, political opinions do kind of melt away in favor of people just figuring out how to build things. And I think that's, as I said before, that's actually being incentivized and accelerated by the institutional corruption problems.
Totally. There's this one critique of sort of classical or the center right now as it relates to sort of the free speech issue in the Harper piece that came out last week or the other week, which is basically like no one gets really far saying things like, affirming that you're right, but just saying that you're going too far, like as opposed to just saying, actually, you're wrong, or you might be wrong. And so the argument of you're right, but you're going too far, not being a strong enough argument to sort of satisfy extremists on either side. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to be like an unwilling interviewee here, but like I genuinely kind of feel like I genuinely find it hard to muster interest in these kind of like internecine institutional disputes, because that's essentially what I see it. It's like, who's on the Harper's letter, who agrees with the Harper's letter. I honestly didn't look into it that much, because to me it's just an utter snooze fest. So I don't really have too much of a take. And in fact, if you don't mind, you've been very kind asking me all these questions. I'd love to ask you a question. I'll bounce this back to you. I mean, for someone like you who's you're a mover, you're a shaker, you're building things, you're doing interesting, cool, original, creative things. I'm genuinely curious why someone like you even cares about, these political opinion questions, right? I mean, like, why? I'd be curious for you to tell me, like, why don't you just completely check out of all of these things and kind of write off all of Harper's, write off all of that stuff, write off all of those people as kind of just not even worth paying attention? And why don't you just like if I were you, I would just be building cool startups and just hanging out with people who are not stupid and interesting and creative and having fun with like my friends. Like I would do that full time. Like that's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm not as far as you. I don't have as much money as you. But I'm curious, like why? Why do you care?
It's a good question. And maybe I shouldn't. I am surprised at how many people in technology do, even if they're sort of, can't publicize that they do. I think the first thing that came to me, maybe it's right, maybe it's not, is, I mean, basically, Facebook and Twitter are really powerful social media platforms, and the policies that they adopt, have really important effects. And sort of to the effect that the battle of ideas is being waged in things like the Harper's Letter or just Twitter generally, to the extent that influences people who work at Twitter and Facebook who are my friends, that's pretty important.
Right. But don't you have access to at least dozens and dozens of people who are super smart, interesting, creative, and see through all the idiocy and would just be happy talking with you directly and creatively and freely, right? Like, why not just surround yourself with those people? And if you have friends who are influenced by like what they read on Facebook, can't you just maybe like not hang out with them as much?
What I mean is people who work at Facebook. So the opinions of people who work at Facebook and Twitter towards free speech are important.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe that's an interesting and productive disagreement. I guess I kind of don't see it as important. Maybe I'm crazy on that, but my attitude is kind of like, if the entire corporate structure of Facebook is getting possessed by kind of the woke mind virus, yep, then all that says to me is, okay, Facebook is going to be over soon, and I'll just look elsewhere. Like I just write it off. Like I'm just like, okay, it's over. It's possessed. It's going to be a rotten corpse before you know it. And so I'm just going to pull out of that and devote all my attention and efforts elsewhere. And so I guess I don't see it as important.
Well, that would be nice if true, and it might be true. And I think it'd be truer for Twitter than for Facebook in the sense of like, I think it's really hard to leave Facebook. Or people have all their friends there, they have all their photos there, and like you hear about people leaving, but there's still 2 billion people on the site. Whereas Twitter is you have your following, and so that matters. But
I guess what I would add to this is that this is my kind of outsider critique of Silicon Valley and kind of VC circles. Is I actually think almost all social groups have these really powerful built-in kind of conformity dynamics. No matter how smart you are, no matter how creative and badass you are, if you are in a scene where there's a cool kids group and all of that, you're almost by definition going to get wrapped up into these kind of status games and these prestige games. And frankly, I think that's kind of why really smart, creative, badass people nonetheless still care so much about these like dying institutions that in many ways, I've written off. And so like I take a good example of this recent like Clubhouse controversy. I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm not in Clubhouse. I'm not that cool. As I was telling you before, I don't actually know many powerful people. I'm not in the cool kids club. But what I thought was really interesting about this was that like, if I hear about a bunch of super smart, creative, badass entrepreneurs and VC people hanging out in like a private space, it boggles my mind that they are talking about like institutional losers. Like, why aren't they just like hanging out in VR, like doing their own ideas, building their own things full time? Like, just check out of all the losers in institutions. Those people are just slow. They're behind. And yeah, they're going to play like ridiculous political games. But I don't know. I guess maybe it's because I'm younger or something like that. I don't know. Like, I just basically see all of those people as on a sinking ship, and I feel bad for them. And what I'm interested in is I want to build private communities and collectives and experiments where smart, cool, creative people just go to do smart, cool, creative things, and they literally forget about everyone on Facebook, and they literally forget about the losers in the Harper's Letter or whatever the case might be. I just want to seriously exit from all of it as a whole and just hang out with cool people and make cool stuff full time. And I think this is available. Like, this is my contention. It does actually happen more and more. Like if you look at like my media diet, like I hang out with cool people all day, like you on your podcast and other people on their podcasts. And I I don't know. I think there's this bias where we still have this traditional idea that an educated, intelligent person is supposed to read the news, and they're supposed to be participating in at the top of the pyramid, the people at the top of the pyramid. But the way that I see it is there's this big traditional pyramid, and yes, there are still some people at the top of it, but that whole pyramid is in flames. It's a big, the big traditional pyramid of society's hierarchy. It's this big, massive dumpster fire. And there are smart, creative people who see it's a dumpster fire. And these smart and creative people are able to build things on their own, on the open market, without any institutional dependencies. And yet, those of us who are doing that, we still are looking at the flaming dumpster fire and like acting as if it matters. Yeah. And I think this is like one of my missions is to basically like try to, I don't know, find ways that smart creative people can just basically let the dumpster fire burn, because all those people, like, they want to be on there. If they want to get off the dumpster fire, they can come hang out with us and do our like cool, creative, constructive things. But if they don't, then they're choosing to hang out in the dumpster fire, and I'm not going to pay any attention to that.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that. I think if I was being most charitable to I'll just call it the biology side of this conversation, why pay attention at all, or why even get involved? I think he would say, or they would say, that we would love to just mind our own business, but hey, people are getting fired, left, and it's happening less now. But CEOs were basically, some of them were being covered negatively in a way that would lead to their firing, and they're sort of like, hey, how does this, sort of media corporation that I'm vaguely competitive with have power to fire me? Like, if imagine if the Coke, CEO had power to fire the Pepsi CEO just based on like a press release that the Coke CEO released. But I think where I agree with you is just build a better one. It's an alternative, instead of just sort of complaining just build a better version of it that eclipses the old one. Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, especially if you're already rich and powerful. I mean, like, how bad is your fall going to be? Frankly, I mean, I almost got fired from academia. I didn't give you the whole long story, but it basically kind of looked like I was going to get fired because I was being very provocative and kind of poking the bear a little too much, and looked like I was maybe going to get fired. I decided to basically just take my ball and go home because I'm proud like that. But basically, I mean, I was basically pushed out in a kind of sudden and precarious situation where my income and my status rapidly decreased very suddenly. And I come from a working class family. Like, I don't have anything to fall back on. So, I guess I don't have a ton of sympathy for like highly powerful, wealthy CEOs who maybe get like taken down from some kind of high profile, social justice mob or whatever, because it's like, if I can take my licks and see it as an exciting affirmative opportunity to be more free and to build something more badass than the dead institutions I got pushed out of. Like, if I can have that attitude and enjoy it and succeed in building something meaningful and have a coherent, passionate, affirmative life story out of it, then surely like a wealthy CEO who, often when they do have these cancellation events, it's not like all of their money is being taken from them or something like that. Often actually the terms are often quite generous, frankly. And so it's like, yeah, go build something else. Go if there's a corporate governance problem, which is really frightening and seriously problematic. Well, great. This is your calling to do something epic. Like, do some alternative with crypto that is going to make that problem like impossible to reproduce. Be the person who leads that. That's a cool calling. It's a blessing to have that. And so I think that should be embraced. And all the people that are doing that kind of stuff should just hang out with each other and only talk to each other.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that's a great place to wrap. My guest today has been Justin Murphy. Justin, has been a fantastic episode. Justin, where can you point people to who want to go deeper and check out your work?
Oh, yeah, sure. I do all of my personal kind of creative intellectual work on a little brand I built called Other Life. You can find that at theotherlifenow.com. I do a podcast and videos, and I write blogs and books and all that. And I'm doing some online courses. And my little startup that I'm building to, creatively and kind of iteratively figure out how to frame the other academic professorial functions that I've traditionally provided in academia. It's called indiethinkers.org. And that's my little effort to, try to package some of the value that I'm able to create as a professor in different ways that hopefully resonates as useful and valuable to people on the internet. So you can check out indiethinkers.org. It's built for people who are trying to do their own independent intellectual life. And so it's a combination of kind of instructional materials and also a social network of other people that are doing this well, and other features like accountability and motivation features, which my underlying thesis there is that, the university has always been this big bundle of all of these different little psychological benefits that empower people to do intellectual work. So as we alluded to before, I'm basically trying to unbundle those and repackage them and frame them as a viable kind of value proposition on the open market on the internet. So I'm doing that with indiethinkers.org. And I just want to say thanks for having me on, Erik.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for coming on. It's been great.
Thank you, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.